Okay, folks, thank you for joining us for today's second panel. The first panel, of course, we discussed a lot of details, what I think most of us, despite Eli's provocations, viewed as the threats of the JCPOA Part 1, also potentially Part 2. Here we're going to talk about where do we go from there? Can we set some parts of the strategy of a future Iran policy? So again, thanks to those of you who joined us in person, thanks to our friends in the media who are covering this, and those who are watching this live and who will watch this later. To discuss this very important issue, we have four distinguished panelists, some of whom are longtime friends of NUFDI, some of whom are new friends. So first of all, to my left, we have Ellie Cohanim, who is the first Iranian-American State Department envoy, presidential envoy. She was the deputy envoy to combat anti-Semitism for the State Department. She's currently a senior fellow at IWF, and both English and Persian is extremely eloquent in standing in solidarity with the people of Iran. So Ellie, thank you for joining us this afternoon now. We also have Blaise who is from JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security. It's a pleasure, Blaise, to have you for the first time at the NUFDI event. Thank you so much for joining us. Previously, he was affiliated with several think tanks here in Washington, including the Bipartisan Policy Center. He studied his graduate degree at Yale, which we won't hold against him, but nobody's perfect. And Gabriel Noronha, who is likely known to many of you, is a former State Department employee, senior advisor to the Iran Action Group under Secretary Pompeo and Brian Hook. And he previously worked in the Senate, doing all sorts of Iran and foreign policy issues. So thanks for joining us today. And Behnam Taleblu, who's a senior fellow at FDD, whereas he is a longtime researcher and expert on the issue of Iran, on the regime's domestic political repression, on domestic political infighting, missiles, and the way it impacts the region. Uniquely to this panel, he is not on Twitter, so that I think is a sign of his excellent mental health compared to the rest of us. So Behnam, thank you. Shaya, thank you for joining us. With that, I kind of want to jump right in with my first question. We'll go first to Gabe. I think in order, Gabe, to decide where we should go from here, what the next path forward is, we should probably do a bit of a review of where we've been. In the previous panel, we had some discussions about the JCPOA, about maximum pressure, President Trump and Secretary Pompeo's maximum pressure policy. There's obviously a lot of rhetoric out there that maximum pressure failed or didn't achieve its objectives. How would you analyze, before we get to where we should go from here, how would you analyze the effectiveness and success of the maximum pressure campaign against the regime of Iran?
Look, and thank you, Cameron, for having me and for putting on this event. There were a lot of speeches given in the Trump administration on Iran. And one of the things we tried to do was really build an intellectual basis for our policy. And we tried to be very clear with the American public about what we were doing, where we were going, whether it was working, and adjust it as necessary. And so President Trump gave several major speeches. Secretary Pompeo gave his major Iran address was announcing maximum pressure and what our goals were. And then we followed it up with a series of congressional testimonies to the Senate and the House, where we laid out very specifically what our aims were. And this was alluded to on the last panel, but there were two, we really condensed it at the end and made clear that there were two related but separate goals. One was to reach negotiations on a comprehensive deal. But in the interim, it was to deprive the regime of the revenue needed to conduct the activities that we had promised. And look, it's no secret that we never got to negotiations. But the goal is not negotiations. It's not an end goal. It's not an end in itself, nor is a deal an end in itself. What we look for is a change in actual behavior and metrics in their ability to fund and conduct those activities. On the latter side, it was a massive success. By our accounting, 70 billion, by the regime's own accounting, $200 billion. We saw massive reductions in their military spending across the IRGC, across their conventional capabilities, on their funding to proxies. So that was very successful. But you also saw the regime become more oppressive domestically. And there's what's sometimes called the J curve in political science of when a regime gets more, the further repressive it gets, and on risky ground, it becomes more oppressive to its people because they're afraid of a crackdown, of an uprising, and that's what we saw in November 2019 when they killed 1,500 Iranians, and we also saw in the aftermath of that the regime was strengthening its domestic capabilities to crack down on protests and prevent that from happening again. So I think my lesson I learned was, and this came from reading a lot of the statements internal to the regime of how Khamenei's circle was thinking about things, how the regime elites were thinking about things, was they have zero intention of having any deal that would look like the deal that the United States under a proper administration, in my view, would accept. In my view, there's no deal that the Iranian regime under Ayatollah Khamenei will accept that the U.S. Senate would also accept as a treaty. I think anyone who thinks there's a possibility for compromise there that could make both parties work is, I think, a little wishful thinking. And I think, unfortunately, this administration is capitulating everything to where the Iranians want it. And as a result, now you're seeing massive backlash in the Senate who won't accept such a treaty. My view is we have to stop, at least for the time being, while Khamenei is in power, while this regime is in its current way of thinking, we have to stop being obsessed with negotiations. That doesn't mean we end diplomacy. Diplomacy is always a path that's open. But when we look at Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, there are always lots of times when we don't have negotiations open with them because they're not productive, because they're not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end. Right now, I don't think that we're in productive capacity for it. And so I think you have to really look at the other options to constrain Iran's behavior, which I think we'll get into. The other thing I would say is, Americans and Europeans should really read Khamenei's writings, and it shouldn't, this shouldn't sound too controversial, but everyone fixates on what the foreign ministry says, which is their external-facing propaganda machine, and no one pays attention. No one reads Farsi, unfortunately. I can't speak for myself. I use a lot of Google Translate to read a lot of their regime speeches, and when you actually read what insiders who have power are thinking, it becomes manifestly clear they have zero desire for cooperation with the West. They don't want to reach accommodation. They do not want peace with the United States. And I think a lot of people simply don't understand that fact. And we rely on this idea that if we send a European negotiator to Tehran, we can reach some accommodation. They don't.
So the negotiations that you're talking about, Gabriel, are, as we discussed in the previous panel, as of now, at least as the Islamic Republic has outlined it, solely on the nuclear topic. Blaise, you've written extensively, and you guys spoke before, and that was something we wanted to get to, was what was also discussed in the first panel, the idea that we have, if we're going to engage the Islamic Republic, which whether we should or should not, we'll get to, I think, shortly, but if we do think that we should have some form of negotiation or some engagement with this regime, as Gabriel said, diplomacy is always on the table, ideally. Is there a way, actually, to move past just this nuclear issue and have some sort of comprehensive conversation with this regime that would, let's say, include its regional terrorism, its terrorism towards the United States, its ballistic missile program, its domestic repression and human rights violations, when the Islamic Republic itself has already admitted multiple times, whether it's Gabriel said by Ali Khamenei or even the pretty, well, not so pretty, but the pretty faces they send out that like Javad Zarif, even they have admitted, we're not going to talk about this issue. So I understand the idea, and I think that would certainly be better than the current negotiations, but is that really possible given what the regime has already said?
Sure. Well, thank you, Cameron, and thanks to NUFDI for organizing this panel and having us all in person. It's nice to do something all together for the first time in a long time. It's great to be with my fellow panelists. If I may, Cameron, I think I might break that question into two different pieces, which is the comprehensive piece of it and the dialogue piece of it. I do think, to your point, part of the problem that U.S. policy on Iran has had for too long and for multiple administrations is that we try to sequence and segment and separate all of our different issues with the regime. And so we say, first we're going to deal with the nuclear issue, then we're going to deal with the ballistic missile issue or the terrorism issue, and the democracy issue is entirely separate. And that's simply not the way that the Iranians operate. If we look at their activity even over the course of the past year and a half that the Biden administration has been in office and trying to negotiate a deal with them, the attacks on Saudi Arabia are not separate from the attacks on the UAE, are not separate from the attacks on US bases and allies in Iraq, are not separate from what's going on in Vienna, are not separate from what's going on in Syria, is not separate from the shipping of arms to the Russians in Ukraine, and so on. And those are all different ways that the Iranians, I think, try to put pressure on us, on the United States, on our European partners, in order to get the concessions that they want to get at the negotiating table in Vienna, as Gabe was just talking about. And I think to separate those out and say we're not going to deal with one set of issues until we've dealt with the nuclear file, for example, has now proven a failure. And I think hopefully we can get to a place where I'm not sure we can get the Biden administration to admit that its policy was a failure, but this idea that first we get a return to JCPOA, then we get a longer and stronger deal, then we address other issues, that sequencing is just not working. And I think we need, if not an admission that it has failed, an admission that it is not possible with this Iranian regime and administration to move on visibly and publicly to a different policy. Would love to get into how we do that. So I do think that US policy needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be comprehensive in a number of ways. It needs to try to address all of these issues at the same time. It needs to use all elements of American power. President Obama famously said in one of his first speeches when he was elected president, I pledge to use all elements of American power to prevent a nuclear Iran. I don't think he necessarily did that, but I think that should be the template here, and that should include a willingness to negotiate if there is reason to. It should include, I think importantly for this regime, political pressure on Iran to improve on its human rights and democracy record. I think it's a shame that for an administration that finally came into office saying that it valued democracy, that it wanted to bring values back into its foreign policy, it is more willing to stick it to US partners and complain about their human rights record than it is to actually address the failings of autocratic regimes that continually undermine US interests, like Iran or Turkey for that matter. It should include economic pressure, and I think importantly it also should include a military element as well, and understand that Iran is engaged not just in the pursuit of nuclear weapons, but is engaged in the pursuit of regional hegemony and a regional military strategy. I think it also needs to include all of our partners. I think we need to recognize that we have partners who are threatened by Iran more so than the US homeland directly, and that the failure of the United States to take seriously the threat that Iran poses to their security is driving those partners away, making it harder for us to pursue other interests with them. And so I think a comprehensive strategy that takes all of that into account is really important. Is that comprehensive strategy a dialogue with Iran on all those issues right now? I'd say it's probably not. I think Iran, as Gabe has laid out, is not interested, even in a return to JCPOA, let alone to the sort of deal that would address all of those issues. That would be a good deal by a bipartisan definition, as Gabe said. And so I think we're in a position where what we need right now is to counter Iranian pressure with pressure of our own in a comprehensive way, and I'm happy to talk about that.
I want to get into that in a few minutes, especially the military option that you mentioned. We need to unpack that as Eli did. But first, I want to ask you, Ellie. This also came up in the previous panel. I think there were probably relatively, with maybe some tactical differences. I think it's on, right? Oh, sorry. I'm just a soft person. That I think we're all somewhat on the same page in a lot of these issues. But before we sort of go forward and say, okay, here's a good strategy, we have to, as was partially done in the first panel, identify properly, as has been unsuccessfully done, I think, certainly by this administration and potentially by previous administrations, with the exception of the previous one maybe, the nature of this regime. And this is something that you talk about a lot, Ellie. You were born in Iran. Spent some time there before you were obviously forced to flee by the mullahs. Can you tell us, especially for non-Iranians or non-Iranian Americans who perhaps analyze Iran with it, our friends in this panel, certainly, I think, understand that, and we don't need to explain to them. But there are others who I think still don't understand the nature of this regime. Can you tell us, from your perspective, what is this regime's nature, and what consequences does that have for U.S. politics to make things more difficult, easier? Lay it out.
Aaron, first of all, thanks to you and to NUFDI for hosting this conversation today. To your question, indeed, I think that to formulate a successful Iran policy for the United States, it's important to understand the nature of the regime. It is, it's a radical revolutionary regime that grabbed power in 1979. And the regime is motivated by a radical Shi'ist, Mahdiist theology, which believes in almost a messianic end of days that will come when the West, in essence, and I would argue the United States, and they've made statements to this, the great Satan will have an end of days war with Iran. And obviously, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is the, he's the figure who is the deputy to this messianic Mahdi figure. And so it's this regime which will save the world and bring the end of days, in essence. So this is the theology that they espouse. And so that's what we're dealing with. And I think that for Western secular policymakers sitting in Washington, D.C., when you yourself are, again, a secular person, it may be impossible for you to imagine that other people are motivated by religion. And I think this is a problem that the West truly has, is on getting into the brain of the other and trying to understand how they think. So, so indeed, it's really important for us to understand the Iranian mentality. The other piece of it, though, Kamran, when you're thinking about U.S. policy, and we spoke a bit about this, the panel before us, is the moment that the United States finds itself in right now. And so we're in a moment where the United States is being challenged by the Chinese Communist Party, and I would argue, and others have as well, that there's an axis of evil right now between China, Russia, and Iran. And so the question, and domestically, the United States is dealing with what I would say is the way that civilizations act when there's civilizational exhaustion, and perhaps how empires behave at the end of their empire. And so this is where the United States finds itself right now. And so when the US is trying to figure out, well, what is our policy specifically with Iran, with this radical theology, Shiist, Mahdiist regime, what we need to ask ourselves is, are we willing to defend ourselves as the great power of the world? Are we willing to, in fact, defend the Western-led international order? And once we're willing, and are we willing to get our domestic crises under control? So when the United States is clear on who we are and what we stand for, and indeed we do stand for human rights, we do support the Iranian people in their quest for human rights and their quest for basic freedom and democracy. And once the US is clear on who we are, what we stand for, and the international order that we want to support, at that point I think it becomes incredibly clear what the policy decisions are, and I'm happy to speak on that.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that specifically, and I want to go to Behnam, give you a chance to talk about this. I think we've got a bit of the past done. What is this regime? What is its nature? Some of the successes of maximum pressure. But I want to talk to you, Behnam, and hear from you, and I think we can pass this on to others as well. Let's say we're planning for a different administration. Let's take as a granted that we won't be able to convince this administration to change its tune, which I think, unfortunately, is probably the case, unless they have some come to Jesus moment. But let's say we're planning for a different administration. You were going to be writing the playbook. You're quarterbacking maximum pressure 2.0.
Hire Kamran immediately.
Well, that would be your first mistake in government. How do we change, how do we augment maximum pressure to maximum pressure 2.0? And then I want to go to Gabe, because I know he's been following this, and Ellie just mentioned this axis of evil, if you will, of the Chinese Communist Party, Putin's Russia, and the Islamic Republic, and go to Gabe and give it to the panel about, are there things that we can learn, tools that have been employed against Putin after his invasion of Ukraine that can be applied down the road to Iran? But first from you, Behnam, what should be changed in max pressure 2.0, and then a bit later in the panel, we'll get into maximum support, which is obviously NUFDI's policy, but I want to start there first.
I think there's a lot to improve on, and there's a lot of ground to really work with. But before we get into some of the specifics, I think it's imperative to, and by the way, not to be Qasid al-Kharazash, or as we say in Persian, the bowl that's hotter than the soup, I also want to strongly echo the thanks to NUFDI and to the panelists for sharing the not virtual stage with me today. So thank you again for organizing, I think, a very timely and important discussion. But to the actual topic at hand, listen, there is the answer to the question, but then there's the question itself and the assumptions that go into the question. And I think that the most critical thing a future administration, or potentially even this administration, should do is to right-size the problem, reframe the problem, because asking the right question is going to guarantee that you get the right answer. And the guaranteed way to get the wrong answer is to ask the wrong question, and then it's to ask it of the wrong people, obviously. There's the personnel as policy component in Washington as well. So one of it, is coming in with the assumptions that Ellie talked about, which is knowing the nature of the regime. The other is to undo, I think, much of the problematic Iran policy thinking that has existed in Washington, which is to treat the foreign and security policy threat of the Islamic Republic as primarily, if not exclusively, as an arms control or non-proliferation problem. If many of you remember, even at the height of the Bush administration, when there was this talk of not just talk of Iran-backed terrorism, but there was Iran-backed terrorism taking American lives in a battlefield in Iraq, there was still this hyper-focus on the nuclear issue. And if many of you don't like the fact that it is now Russia that is midwifing a potential nuclear deal with the Iranians, you should know that that framework, that P5+1 framework, was born of an overcorrection of the Iraq framework, and that came about in the 2006 period. So the reason that we're working by, with, and through the P5+1 is a result of some of the wrong thinking that has existed then, and it's been very kind of bureaucratic inertia since then. We've just kind of stuck with it despite changed facts on the ground. So in this respect, I think it's very important to look at Iran as a much broader problem, as part and parcel of this new dialogue, this new framework that's existing, which is great power competition, and then the partners and proxies of the great powers, which, if you're going to have Russia and China in a tier 1 threat to the U.S. national security, to U.S. potentially homeland interests, and to U.S. partners in different theaters around the world, well, then you have other rogue or revisionist states, such as North Korea and such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then looking at other theaters, potentially Cuba and Venezuela even, then learning to deal with functional threats that span across geographies, such as terrorism and the linkage of violent non-state actors, terror groups that exist around the world to any of these rogue states or great power competitors. Then thinking smartly about the functional issues, cyber, nuclear, money laundering and illicit finance, and seeing how, again, they tie back into the states. It's to have a state-centric component and to see that in many of these issues, many of these functional issues, we actually do see that many of these roads do lead to Rome, or many of these roads do lead to Tehran. And that's why having a comprehensive policy and not just a nuclear-only or a nuclear-first policy is perhaps the most critical thing the next administration can do. I think it is imperative to leave the door open for diplomacy, but to not be so maniacally obsessed with diplomacy. I think in this respect, sanctions do serve a purpose. They literally make your adversary fight with one arm tied behind your back. But if we are proponents of pressure, we need to think about, well, what if the adversary says yes? I think that's what you need to be more afraid of than if they say no. What if the adversary says yes? And we saw a little bit of this debate now with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps foreign terrorist organization potential delisting, which is, what if the regime said, okay, I promise not to fund terrorism? How do you verify that? How do you prove that? Is it through a sustained change in behavior? How do you verify the sustained change in behavior? What if an Iran-Iraq proxy does it? There are all these endless series of basements that if we take something that I do like, and I think Gabriel, I don't want to speak for on behalf of the panel, which is the Pompeo 12 points, and then add the very critical, the very important point, which is the democracy promotion, support for rule of law, support for justice for the freedom-seeking Iranian people, add that as a critical 13th point in there, and move towards a maximum care, maximum support kind of position. How do you make sure that when you're trying to achieve goals 1 through 12, you don't sell out goal number 13? And that's to have very clear backstops. And that means that on some things that the regime identifies as a core national security interest, like something I'm hyper-obsessed about, like ballistic missiles or cruise missiles or drones, if they don't negotiate over that, then you don't simply give them the cash to delay the problem or kick the problem down the road. Then you develop other frameworks separate from negotiations, and I believe Mohammed was talking about this in the previous panel. We need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and that means that we can have a discussion about potentially limiting, Iran's nuclear program, but we're also going to be doing things that disrupt, devalue, deter, and when needed, defang, and we can put meat on the bones as to what those 4Ds look like. When you're intercepting Iranian arms transfers, when you're potentially sabotaging Iranian procurement networks, when you're exposing and sanctioning those procurement networks, when you're striking militias that transport these arms, when you're doing all of these things, you're actually increasing your leverage for a potential agreement at the negotiating table. So having a combined arms approach while never taking your eye off the ball, that the regime's nuclear program is not separate from the nature of itself. It literally resurrected the nuclear program amid a 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war. The regime elite, Gabriel was talking about listening to what they say. They call this conflict the holy defense or the sacred defense. Everybody who is anybody in the Islamic Republic can trace their origins to this conflict. So to know how imperative this conflict is, they resurrected a nuclear program not as a science fair project, but literally as a potential weapon to offset someone they were fighting. And the Islamic Republic would like to talk that it has this nuclear fatwa, this alleged nuclear fatwa, to prevent the use or stockpiling or production or procurement of WMDs. But if you trace back the empirical record, and US intelligence has actually declassified this, Iran did use chemical weapons in that war, even though it did majorly receive large offensive attacks by Saddam against its own forces, as well as against the Kurds, as well as against innocent Iranian citizens by the Iraqis using chemical weapons. So Iran has broken the chemical barrier. The thing is, how do you make sure that our attempt to prevent them from crossing the nuclear threshold doesn't end up empowering all of the unconventional and conventional thresholds that they have already crossed? So it's high time to think properly about the Iran issue, right-size the nuclear issue, and move towards a comprehensive Iran policy, and adding in that critical 13th point.
I want to come back to the 13th point, but you use the phrase putting meat on the bones. And I want to go to Gabriel on this, because I know certainly all the panelists and everyone watching this has been following the Russian invasion or Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Have there been actions taken, Gabriel, by the Biden administration? I know they sort of started off slowly and had a really sort of wimpish response. Perhaps they've gotten a bit better. I'm not an expert in that field. Have there been actions that the Biden administration have taken against Putin, against Putin's regime, against Putin's oligarchs and thugs? Or are there actions that our allies, European partners, have taken against them as a response to their invasion of Ukrainian sovereignty that you think down the road could and should be applied to the Islamic Republic?
Look, I think if you look at 2019, the United States, if you look at Treasury and you ask Treasury, what was the most important country that you worked on in 2019, it would have been Iran. And we really accelerated what a sanctions program could look like then. If you look at 2022 now, Treasury is employing some, not all, of the same measures and seriousness towards Russia. I have a lot of issues with the things that they need to do. But they're also, and this is a key point, having creativity, which I will credit them for, of saying, okay, what about yachts? Let's take yachts. So much of Russia's wealth is stored in oligarchs' hard capital abroad, whether it's their apartment flats in London or their mega yachts in Fiji. And the ability for countries to say, okay, we're going to confiscate that is a very important step. And I can tell you that is not an easy fight to make with interagency between DOJ and Treasury and NSC. And that's something we need to look at as well, because I see stories all the time of IRGC shopping trips to Turkey, to Istanbul, where they spend millions of dollars, or there's plenty of kids of regime elites in fancy sports cars in Beverly Hills. Those are all the things, that money is all eventually expropriated from the Iranian people. And that's something that we should look at. That being said, here's what my colleagues at Treasury would have said back in the day, which I agree with now. You're going after small fish. And that is not going to change the regime. That's not going to fix your nuclear issue. That's not going to fix the terror issue. If you want to fix those issues, it's about oil exports, it's about metals and petrochemicals. Those are your big three things that are really the basis of the Iranian economy. And this is where I am the naysayer and sort of the, I don't always come bearing good news, unfortunately, which is I think in 2025, if we're going to reimpose maximum pressure, it's going to be a lot harder than it was in 2018 and 2019.
Why is that? Can you clarify?
So what is a sanction? A sanction basically is a demand. You either have the choice to do business with the United States and all our banks and every bank connected to it, or you have a choice to do business with Iran. Now, if you're a European company, that's the easiest decision you will have ever made. And that's why we don't really even have to have the Europeans at the negotiating table in Vienna for the sanctions purpose, because all their companies, by and large, with a couple exceptions, abide by our sanctions because it's a very easy decision for them. But what we're seeing now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is we are separating back into the Cold War period where you had a Soviet economy and the non-Soviet economy. We are heading back in that direction where you're going to see the Russian system isolated from the West as long as this keeps up. The Chinese, and this is what we experienced, started just ignoring our sanctions, and we would hit them. We hit several Chinese oil and petrochemical companies, but then normally if that company is doing something bad, you have to go up the chain. And you say, okay, who are their banks? We'll sanction those banks. But it turns out, eventually you hit the People's Bank of China. And are you going to sanction the Central Bank of the People's Republic of China? If you want to do that, that's a pretty big deal, and that's going to basically end up upend global trade. And so there is a limit to what we can do with China. China knows that. That's why they've been importing millions of barrels of oil per day from Iran. And the unfortunate fact is that 4 years from now, 3 years from now, their ability to withstand our sanctions pressure is going to increase. And so we have to think creatively, but we also have to recognize candidly that our means of economic pressure in 2025 are not going to be as great as they were in 2018. And this is why I sort of caution those of us who want to put pressure on Iran and say, okay, we have a lot of means, we have a lot of desired goals, we have a lot of demands. What are our means to actually put pressure on Iran to accomplish those?
So I want to come back to this issue, and I'll come back to you, Behnam, but I want to direct a question to Ellie and Blaise. And Blaise, if you want to add on that, please feel free to. Both of you mentioned, and again, it was mentioned in the first panel, a military option, some sort of threat. I think as probably all of you know, we at NUFDI are against war with Iran, as I imagine all of you are also against war. And Eli made this point on the first panel, which is we have to dissociate the notion of supporting democracy and human rights in Iran from some Iraq a la 2003 invasion. It's not what anyone wants, although I'm certain that the four of you have been called warmongers just as many times as we have, and we all know it's farcical. But so putting that aside, the fact that nobody wants war, we're all opposed to war. You both mentioned the necessity from an American national security perspective of having a credible option on the table. What benefit does that provide us? How does that improve U.S. national security? Is that not driving, the critics would say that would drive the regime towards more extreme reaction? What is the benefit and necessity of having that, Blaise and Ellie, in your opinion, given this division that we've made between nobody wants war, but this has to be there?
You know, if I had Joe Biden's ear right now, I would tell him to immediately put the military option back on the table, because we know diplomacy has failed. I think we can call a failure, a spade at this point. And so to put the military option back on the table means that Joe Biden would have to articulate that he's doing that. We'd have to start to see drills, and we'd have to be willing to take out Iran's nuclear program. And so, Cameron, what that brings me to next is what should our Iran policy be globally, looking at it? And the reality is, once you understand that you are in this global fight, you know, U.S. versus China, Russia, Iran, it becomes clear, and you understand the nature of the Iranian regime and the fact that they are adversaries and call us enemies. It becomes clear that the United States really has no choice but to be working towards regime collapse. Now, that's a term that was coined by Mike Makovsky at JINSA, and so I want to give him more credit for that. And what regime collapse means is not is not regime change, meaning we're not advocating for the United States to be invading Iran as we did with Iraq, but really allowing the forces of nature to take its course. And what that would mean for the United States is, yes, we defend US national security policies and we defend our allies in the region by taking the military option, understanding that the Iranian people have taken to the streets over and over again. And so another natural consequence of our defending our national security and allies' security interests is that the Iranian people would most likely see an event like that as an opportunity to fight for their freedom, and the United States can stand with them as they do that. That is the policy that the United States should be working towards. I also want to just throw in that we should be arming our allies and allowing them to have the maximum ability to defend themselves against the Iranian regime. And we should be working towards bringing Israel into what my brilliant colleagues in the Trump administration worked on, the Middle East Strategic Alliance. The next step for MESA is to integrate Israel into MESA, and we're seeing again some of that happening naturally with Israel hosting. Just last month, they hosted Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Egypt in Israel for the first time on Israeli soil. So some of that is naturally taking place in the region, but the United States should be integrating Israel formally into MESA and creating a formal defense structure against the Iranian regime. The other piece of it, and Victoria Coates in the last panel mentioned this, is that the United States should be prepared. We should be preparing ourselves for a regime collapse moment. We all know that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is an older man, and he's not going to live forever. So even if there's absent any U.S. intervention, we could see a regime collapse moment with his death. Are we prepared for that? And I think the United States should be fully prepared to, again, support the Iranian people's quest for freedom and democracy. And there's no reason for us to be traumatized by the Iraqi experience. There's definitely a way for regime collapse to happen in a managed manner so that the people of Iran are ready and capable of taking control over their country.
I want to come back to that and also the issue of our friends in the Persian Gulf. But Blaise, please go ahead.
Thanks. So maybe I can start by touching briefly on the previous question with some bad news, but then maybe answer this question with some good news. I think the bad news is that whatever lessons we might be learning from the Ukrainian conflict, the Iranians are learning one big lesson from that. And that's if you have a nuclear weapon and you threaten to use it, you can get away with murder. And I think the threats that we've seen from Russia and the way they've deterred a U.S. response to this invasion are seen loudly and clearly in Tehran, and I think that's driving them into further cementing their decision that they want to have a nuclear deterrent at some point. I think that leads me to the second set of bad news, which is I'm not sure we have until the next administration to solve this problem. Iran already has a weapons worth of 60% enriched uranium. I think it's not unlikely that given the failure of negotiations, we're going to see some form of nuclear advance once again from Iran in the very near future, which is going to be aimed at putting further pressure on the Biden administration to capitulate, but is going to bring them even one more step closer to a nuclear weapon. By our own analysis at JINSA, we estimate that Iran is 3 to 4 weeks away from breakout if it were to decide to sprint for a weapon today. That's getting awfully close to our ability to actually detect, act, and prevent them from gaining a nuclear capability. So I'm not sure Iran is going to be waiting for the next administration, and I'm not sure that necessarily our partners and allies are going to be waiting for the next administration. This is an existential threat, particularly for Israel. And I think that were Iran to decide to start enriching to 90%, start turning 60% enriched uranium into metal, or taking other steps, doing even more to kick out inspectors from some of its enrichment facilities, they're going to be on the horns of a dilemma that could force them to act. And that would create the sort of war that we all want to avoid. So I think going to the good news, a couple of points. First, I think we have a major asset in Congress. One of the things I think is different now than in 2015 is that the bully pulpit actually belongs to Congress, not to the president. And we've seen, going back to Senator Menendez's floor speech in early March, to a number of Democratic Representatives led by Congressman Gottheimer and Congresswoman Noronha coming out opposing the deal. Congress's concerns really reverberate and change the course of action by this administration. They managed to shoot down its attempts to cave on the IRGC delisting demand, and they managed to get the administration to actually start giving briefings on what's going on with the negotiations. And so I think Congress here can really push the administration to change its policies. I think two other points of good news. One is that Iran does think we're the great Satan. And however feckless we might feel sometimes, or we might feel our policy is sometimes, however much we might worry about withdrawal or a weak force posture in the region, the Iranians do take advantage of that. But I think always in the back of their mind is concern about what is the United States going to do. And with my colleague Ari Sikrel at JINSA, we've been tracking Iranian attacks against us, against our partners and allies in the region. And while they've been generally going up since we entered into the JCPOA, you see very clear moments where they go down when the Iranians are trying to reevaluate what are the Americans going to do? Is this a change of policy? Are they coming after us? You saw this first of all in 2003 with the Iraq War. You saw this in 2012 when Prime Minister Netanyahu drew a bright red line at the UN General Assembly, and the Iranians were worried about the Israelis coming after them then. But you see it in smaller instances. You see it in November of 2016 when President Trump was elected and the Iranians suddenly started slowing down and were worried about what was going to happen. You saw it in the spring of 2018 when they were worried about whether President Trump was going to withdraw from the JCPOA, and the immediate aftermath of that, where they were worried what's going to happen now. And most importantly, we saw it after the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. It was short-lived, but there was a period after the immediate retaliation that the Iranians undertook where they paused their attacks. And they were really waiting. Is this the beginning of a new U.S. policy against us? Is this going to be a more robust statement, or was this a one-off? Once they figured out it was a one-off, then those attacks resumed. But there's always that fear in the back of their minds. And I think that really plays to our advantage. The third point, third set of good news, as Ellie laid out, is that we have willing and capable partners that do want to push back against Iran, that are pushing back against Iran, that are looking for help in pushing back against Iran. And so I think when we talk about a military strategy, yes, we want the President of the United States to say all options are on the table, including a military option against Iran, if necessary, to prevent it from acquiring a nuclear capability. But more importantly, that means several things. One, a policy of robust and forceful retaliation against Iran for the actions of Iranian proxies. They have to understand that we're going to not tolerate them attacking our allies and our partners in the region, and that we're going to put the return address against Iranian assets, not against the proxies. Two, it means a new doctrine for the United States, where President Biden can come out and say, I have a new Biden doctrine. I'm updating the Carter doctrine. I'm not going to allow an external power or an internal power to dominate the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. I think just that statement of support and change of heart by the United States, given Iranian paranoia, would go a long way. And then third, the military option should be and can be first and foremost defensive. We need to build on the Abrahamic Accords. We need to build on the move of Israel into Central Command. We need to build on the cooperation that the Fifth Fleet is already undertaking in the various task forces it has, whether in the Persian Gulf to work against Iranian drones and swift boats, or in the Red Sea to interdict Iranian arms shipments. If we commit ourselves to actually supporting our partners, to helping them build out defenses against Iran, whether that is trying to build a regional integrated air defense system that tries to stop Iranian drones from being able to rain down on the capital cities of our partners, whether that is making sure that our partners and allies have the tools and weapons that they need to go after Iran's regional strategy. Israel has asked for KC-46 aerial refueling tankers and precision-guided munitions that it needs, and the Biden administration has said, not now. If we change that approach, if we make it visible to the Iranians that we are actually standing by and supporting our partners who have the will and capability to push back, then I think that's going to send a very strong message that is going to cause the Tehran regime to rethink whether it wants to continue escalating, whether that is its regional aggression or its nuclear program.
Behnam, before we go to this last section that I want to talk about, what Ellie called well as a policy of regime collapse, and what does that mean? And what should the United States do? I know you wanted to add a bit about the previous discussion about sanctions. Please go ahead.
Actually, there's been so much said. I would love to respond to each speaker if it's possible. But should I just wait for the next round?
Sure. Okay, we'll get in the next round. So I apologize not to put you on the spot, but we've talked a lot about different negotiating tactics, levers of pressure that the United States should apply, be they economic, be they kinetic, be they working with their partners in the region. But I think one thing that frustrates lots of people, Navi talked about how the Iranian people decided to do this. Obviously, I've never been to Iran, so I don't speak on their behalf. But one thing that we hear, I know Ellie probably hears this a lot of the Persian language, social media interaction that she gets. Certainly, Gabriel, you saw it state when you guys were running such an effective USA data Farsi, which has now been, it's really now the voice of the Islamic Republic effectively, much like the BBC Persian service, unfortunately. But what do you think, just by show of hands, that this regime can actually, or will be willing to change its behavior in a fundamental way that would meet the national security needs of the United States and our friends and allies? Is that possible? Or
It's not a monadic question. It shouldn't be yes or no. The regime has changed its behavior, but it's never changed its behavior in a sustained fashion. And just like everything that we've talked about, working towards regime change or regime collapse, aggressive repositioning, better deterrence, better containment, or sanctions, and levying versus enforcement, these are not monadic debates. These are not do it or don't do it. It's do it and then how do you stand by it over time. That's the real test for U.S. policy. I have little issues with immense respect. I didn't want to be the one to now make a little bit of distance with all the panelists, but I will say, for instance, as someone like me who is, doesn't want the Iran debate to be dominated by an arms control non-proliferation policy debate, with immense respect to Ellie's service and wisdom and knowledge on this issue, one of the fastest ways to do it is to go for a full regime collapse policy, because Iran has the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Thanks to the deal known as the JCPOA, for instance, Iran has tons of fissile material on its own territory. So if you want, in some ways, the Iran debate to only be just about non-proliferation, just about arms control, working to collapse central authority will create the first-order threat tier of, oh my God, we don't have time to deal with Iranian democratization. Oh my God, we don't have time to intercept Iranian anti-tank weapons. Oh my God, we don't have time to facilitate Israel and the Abrahamic Accords, because we have to account for every iota of low-enriched uranium, medium-enriched uranium, potentially high-enriched uranium that exists on Iranian soil. We have to make sure that the IEA, which was not getting access then, is able to account for all of these things. We're worried about plugs and hours of monitoring tapes. The full-on collapse of central authority with no U.S. Plan B or Plan C is the surest way to secretly pave the way, with immense respect, to make sure that that wing of the debate overcomes the more necessary, more important, the larger comprehensive Iran policy, Iran democratization, a regional ground game on Iran. This is just my view. It's a way that the other side has actually been able to stifle and handicap this debate.
So I think what Ellie said, and I'll let her speak for herself, I won't speak on her behalf, but I think what she said, regime collapse, that's what the end goal should be. Let's talk about the things.
I think we should be.
Right.
I think we
Right.
should
So
be
the
prepared
point-
for it.
So
So
in
the
that
point is that we should be preparing. We should be preparing. I don't know if anyone has prepared. I don't know if our allies
we're working on it. We'll let you.
right, and I don't know if our allies in the region, some of them may have prepared. There may be people who are thinking about a regime collapse moment and what happens and what's our plan in that. But certainly the United States should be working on it.
And I want to then just give this question to the panel. Perhaps we can start with you, Gabe, and work through Blaise and go back around. We've seen historically with other totalitarian regimes, let's say, for example, the Soviet Union, and my personal opinion, and again, next to these four experts, my personal opinion is quite meaningless, but the policy that the United States had towards the Soviet Union was perhaps a good model that could be applied towards the Islamic Republic, which was, I think, sort of has some of the safety measures in place that you're talking about, Behnam, but the ultimate policy objective that you're referring to, Ellie, which is getting rid of this regime. And I'm sure there are Soviet experts who may correct me on the specifics of this, but ultimately, the United States was saying that the Soviet Union was an evil empire that should collapse. However, at the same time, that it was supporting Soviet dissidents, that it was giving very immense amounts of moral support. You can talk to people like Natan Sharansky about this and how much that how meaningful that was to the pro-democracy movement in Russia and the Soviet Union. At the same time that it was doing that, they were negotiating things like SALT. They were working on arms control. They were working on the support of they didn't quite do as much fundamentalist group support as Islamic Republic does, but working on all these issues. Is that a reasonable framework? We don't just have to go, let's say, for a pure regime change policy, but we can address these issues that we're all talking about here, the Islamic Republic's nuclear agenda, its ballistic missiles, but simultaneously support the Iranian people in their objectives. Is that a reasonable policy?
Oh, I think it is, and I'm very glad you mentioned Soviet Union. And if I have my dates correct, in 1946, George Kennan writes his long telegram, which starts the policy of containment. It takes 43 years for the Soviet Union to collapse, which is coincidentally
43 sounds like a good number. We'll take it.
Coincidentally, the age of the Islamic Republic today. However, we have not had a long, sustained bipartisan approach of containment because, unfortunately, the Obama administration and currently the Biden administration have truncated those. When you do that, and you look at, my metric I use is foreign currency reserves, inflation, and GDP growth are my three proxies I use for looking at Iran's economic health broadly. Iran is coming back in the green, and so it's very tricky to do that. On a couple points, one on have we planned for regime collapse? The answer is no. That was something I tried to work at the State Department, and unfortunately, it is not something the U.S. government plans for as much as it ought to. I'll leave it at that. And candidly, there's a lot of concern that the situation would not look good. And if you look at what happens in Syria or Venezuela, and all the immense amount of planning that happens that goes into what would a North Korean collapse look like, there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of people in the U.S. government and foreign governments that do not really want to see that happen for various reasons. The other point I'd make is, in the last 10 years, we thought we would see a lot of regimes collapse. We thought Syria would get overthrown, that Assad would get overthrown. We were convinced that Maduro was on his way out. If you have 1,000,000% inflation, we were convinced that was going to happen. We know where they are now. So I think, I would love to see nothing more than to see the Islamic Republic gone. I'm very wary that it's not going to happen. And so I think the way you have to frame it is something you can hope for, but it's not something that you should necessarily take in as a given. And I heard a lot of the time when I was in the administration, give it 3 months, give it 6 months, we're going to see the regime collapse. And I heard that for my entirety of my 2 years in government. And so that has partly changed the way I think of this is we should do that. And if I don't know if we're getting this question or the next question of ways we can support the Iranian people.
Please go ahead.
So, there are sanctions which are very good. Sanctions to me are a moral question of justice because you have judges and you have IRGC generals that execute Iranians en masse, and they face zero accountability from their own government. And the only modicum of accountability you can have is when the United States puts a sanction on them and says all your wealth abroad is frozen. You will not be able to travel outside Iran or at least to the United States. And what that does to the families, and I talked to a lot of the family members of those victims, and they're incredibly appreciative. But if you want to do something tangible to help the Iranians, it's internet access. And then what do Iranians ask for all the time? If you look at what they're talking about, it's in Khuzestan, they want water. In most of Iran right now, they're asking, they barely have money for bread. These are the things that they want, and they ask for dignity for. Water, I think, is a really interesting question. Israel is the pioneer throughout the world of water techniques. I mean, it's a desert, and they've turned it into, this might be slight exaggeration, an oasis. And the United States and Gulf countries have huge water purification processes, and we know how to deal with this. In terms of a carrot, the Iranian people don't care about sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran or on the IRGC. They would love to see water flowing properly, having a good water management system. That is a carrot that we should be offering Iran. And in a New Deal, we should say, look, we're going to send a goodwill team with 100 water engineers. We're going to install water purification systems. There's a lot of things that the Iranian people want, which the Iranian government will never ask for because they don't care about it. But we should start thinking creatively that way of how can you work directly with the people. Maybe that's support for labor strikes, which is something we've talked about a lot. But understanding that what the regime elite want is something very different from what 78 million Iranians want, who are not in the posh neighborhoods of Tehran.
Blaise, Ellie, if you want to add anything, please do. And then I want to ask one or two final questions, especially about the region.
Sure. So, without getting too far down the road of looking at Cold War policy, I think I wouldn't want to confuse Iran with the Soviet Union. It doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's much smaller. It's not a world power. And so I don't think we necessarily need to follow the same approach or think that we're constrained in some of the same ways that we were constrained in dealing with the Soviets during the Cold War. But I do think a couple of points are worthwhile. I do think there was an evolution in what our containment strategy was during the Cold War. And that was to go from not caring about internal developments in the Soviet Union to actually putting pressure on the Soviets for their human rights issues. So, when you look at 1956, the Soviets invade Hungary. 1968, they put down protests in Czechoslovakia. We do nothing. But then starting in the 1980s, first martial law in Poland, the solidarity strikes. You have President Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. We starting back early in the 70s with the refuseniks. We start putting pressure on the Soviet Union for human rights issues. That actually starts bearing fruit because, as Gabe was saying, it's also showing the people that live there, that we're more interested in their well-being than the regime is. So I do think that is one important lesson from the Cold War, but I wouldn't want to overemphasize that. I do think another thing that we should think about is both to Gabe and Ellie's point about how things might be harder in the future, and the fact that we have this axis, Russian, Chinese, Iranian axis growing. I think it's also going to be harder to push for democracy and human rights in the future, because one of the things that you're seeing coming out of China is the technological securitization of societies through surveillance software, through exporting some of these techniques. It might go the other way as well. The Iranians might start exporting some of their techniques for keeping their people down. And I think that one of the things we might see going forward is the Iranian regime actually investing more of its money into trying to maintain control over its society. And might take some of the lessons that it's seeing from how Russia is doing that today during the Ukraine war, both in silencing dissent, enforcing people who are potential dissenters out of Iran, and imposing some of those technological controls as well. So I do think that is something that we should watch, and a way in which we should think about the problem of Russia, China, and Iran as interlinked.
Well, before I give it to Ellie, I think you're exactly right, Blaise. Indeed, with this 25-year China-Iran deal, in fact, we saw exactly that. One of the components that Iranians were most worried about was basically the import of state surveillance technology, whether it's high-powered street cameras that can identify people through their homes, through the windows of their homes, through their cars. So I think that's certainly a big fear that people have. And to Gabriel's point, it's almost a race against time. I hope that we'll have that, but we'll watch. Ellie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Blaise just said, which is I don't think you can compare Iran to the former Soviet Union. We were both, the US and the FSU were superpowers, and we don't have an equal status with Iran, although the Biden team has been acting as such in the Vienna talks, and in fact they've been acting as if that was the greater global power. But so where does that leave us? I think that what we need to understand, and when you're talking about the urgency of the moment, is that perhaps we're in a moment of historical shift right now. Again, so the reason why people were predicting that there would be all these regime changes, but then they didn't happen, Gabe, to your point, is not necessarily because it couldn't happen, but Russia, China, Iran, and to some extent Venezuela, they're saving each other, they're supporting each other, they have an alliance with each other, right? So if we as the United States understand that there's an alliance on the other other side. The question, again, that behooves us is how are we going to address this alliance that is trying to undermine us in every theater, right? And so that's, that's what has to determine our policy is to be very clear about what the other side is doing. So I'm not sure if the fact that we haven't seen regime change or we haven't seen things play out as one might have hoped means that there's no possibility for other outcomes. What it means, though, is that the United States probably has to do things a bit differently. The other point I want to make is that historically, American administrations probably expected that they had 8 years for their policies, right? We saw with the Trump administration that we wound up having 4 years, and many people are predicting that Joe Biden may also, the Democrats may also have 4 years. So one other dramatic shift that I think we need to start thinking when we set our policies is, I have 4 years to see success. And so that also, I think, should lend greater urgency in what we do. And what it brings me back to, again, is military options on the table, being clear about who our enemies are, what their nature is, and what we need to do within the 4 years that we might have.
Only very briefly to say, 100% of, we see Iran, China, Russia helping them each other. They all help, Russia and Iran helped Assad stay alive in Syria. The issue is when you have statements from the State Department and White House saying that Russia and China share our interest on Iran, it undermines the entire nexus of everything we're trying to do on all the fronts of authoritarianism.
Agreed, Behnam.
The differences between the ideologies of this kind of power, if you look at it in kind of like a Venn diagram, that overlap, each of these countries believes they have the right to be the hegemon in their own region. They want to overturn the balance of power that they believe is supported by the US against them, and they will be willing to run cover mostly for the other power when it suits them, because ultimately what they're trying to do is upend the US-led or US-supported world order. And so they'll help each other out. And in this case, one of the most interesting things, the Islamic Republic, which for 43 years has been crusading to say neither East nor West is Islamic Republic, the most curious, obscure, perverse thing is that with this ultra-hardline ascendancy inside Iran, really for the past decade and a half, you see the phrase neither East nor West Islamic Republic be to save the Islamic Republic and fight the West, go East. And Iran is increasingly willing to be a pawn in the hands of Russia and China in their strategic game competition with the West. And the biggest losers in this are the Iranian people. The biggest losers in this is Iranian nationalism. The biggest loser in this is Iran's sovereignty. And this is slated to actually get worse, not better over time. So I think actually right-sizing the threat, having the right questions, having the right assumptions, looking at this exactly as Ellie said, as an axis. They don't have to share every single ideational political interest. They don't have to think in terms of the same values or virtues. But ultimately, they're firing at us and they're firing at our friends. And that means that that's where the buck has to stop. That's where the first line of defense has to be. And ultimately, it doesn't happen just over there. There's this huge discussion, Ellie mentioned, the civilizational inflection. These are the debates that are being had on the Hill right now. These are debates, on Main Street across America really being had about what kind of country is America going to be? What kind of foreign policy do we want to have? Well, it's not just limited to the Middle East or Northeast Asia or some Eurasian steppe or Eurasian plain. It's happening in the Western Hemisphere. The Iranian oil minister was in Venezuela and Nicaragua just for a few days, and they learned from one another. We, in 2009, started sanctioning refined petroleum products in Iran. Iran used a decade of sunk cost experience to be able to actually improve its refining capacities. Now it's doing a swap with Venezuela to help them improve their refining capacities. One adversary is helping the other. It's like a Russian nesting dolls in reverse.
So what's been outlined here is we each alluded to it, is this axis of resistance. The Islamic Republic itself uses the phrase axis of resistance when it talks about itself, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, its proxies in Iraq and other parts of the region. This is a sort of a different axis you're referring to. But I think what's a key part of this is that the Islamic Republic, you use the term Behnam pawn, has accepted the role of being a pawn, of being an errand boy for these two larger and more advanced powers, Russia and China. So if we agree that these countries are acting as an axis, and that they are the ones that, for example, to Gabriel's point, are preventing democratic transitions and the development of Western or American allies in Syria, in Venezuela, they're the ones propping up these dictators. I think what many people, if you follow the rabbit trail, get back to is the Islamic Republic here in the center. So if we agree that the current policy is not working, there have been a few things outlined of what has to be done going forward. This was sort of our last segment. Ellie, you talk about planning for a potential collapse, transitioning, entering to the United States. Gabe, you also mentioned the fact that the State Department of the U.S. has not done enough planning of not should the Islamic Republic fall, but if it does, what should we do? So those are, I think, a lot of things that are takeaways. It's certainly homework for NUFDI, and I think you all know that we're working on those things if we can beat the time clock. But the issue of this axis that you mentioned, how can we put together, how can the United States form a similar coalition? And who should be part of that? Ellie, you mentioned Israel, the necessity of Israel being involved. Mesa, in the previous panel, of course, we talked about our other friends in the Persian Gulf. We talked about Saudi Arabia, we talked about Blaise, you mentioned UAE and other countries. But Gabriel, you mentioned the threat that we're facing right now of falling back into a bipolar world. And there's a lot of discussion that maybe some of our friends in the region or elsewhere, because of the current policies of this administration and of the Obama administration, may not, as we had thought, automatically want to be part of the American coalition. So what does the United States have to do? What leadership has to be shown? Is it American leadership? Is there something else that we have to do to get who have been traditionally our allies, that I would argue the Obama and the Biden administration have not only ignored, but in many ways insulted? How can we get them on the same side? How can we incentivize them? How can we work with them to ensure that they're on our side? And when there's certainly significant economic benefits, I would imagine, that Russia and China are able to offer. How can the United States effectively, part of the long-winded question, form this coalition that would, in our view, include the Iranian people? How can we do that? Is it possible?
Yeah, absolutely, it's possible, and the region is desperate for us to do that. This is what you're describing, Kamran, is a direct result of the Biden administration's policies, and so, in essence, we need to reverse these policies. What that means is that we need to immediately show support again for the security interests of our allies, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of Israel, of the Gulf states, that are daily seeing both their civilians and civilian sites attacked by Iranian proxies. And so those are immediate steps that we can take. Again, I mentioned that we should be creating a formal defense structure for the Gulf countries and for Israel integrated into that, so that they can have a formal architecture to defend themselves against Iran. But also, again, I think it's become very unpopular in the United States in both parties to say that the US cannot and should not abandon the Middle East, North Africa region. But I will loudly say that the United States should not be abandoning the MENA region, that we shouldn't be dismantling the US empire. And while I'm not a warmonger, I understand that if you want to stay the global superpower, then there are steps that you need to take in order to do that, which sometimes means military and other options. And I'm not willing to give up on the United States being the global superpower. I don't want my children and grandchildren to live in the world where the Chinese Communist Party is the global superpower. I don't want my kids to live in a medical security state. I don't want the world to suffer through that. And I think we all discussed, we don't have endless amounts of time to try to change this tide. And so we cannot give up the MENA region as one feeder for the United States. So we actually need to go back into the MENA region. Again, I know both Republicans and Democrats don't think this is a popular stance, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. And I think that it's rather naive for Americans to believe that we can abandon the MENA region and it's not going to come back to bite us here in the United States. I think we would eventually see the consequence of that ourselves. But why wait? Let's be ahead of the curve. So again, those are the recommendations that I would have for us. We need to again recommit to the MENA region, help them build their own security structure, put the military options back on the table with gusto, and that the President of the United States needs to express the policy that we will do whatever we need to do for our own national security, and we're not afraid of any consequence because we are the greatest military power. We can do whatever it takes as a second step, should the Iranians retaliate, as an example.
So I guess a couple of points. I think first and foremost, we do need to show up, as Ellie was just laying it out. But I think just getting a declaration that the JCPOA is dead, I think would do wonders for the region. And again, I am a big admirer of Rousseau, and one thing he wrote always stuck in my mind, right? We should take laws as they should be and men as they are. We should take policies as they should be and policymakers as they are. I don't think the Biden administration is going to come out and say this was a mistake, but if we give them the opportunity to say, we're doing something different, just that would have a magical effect for our partners who have been, I think, just very concerned over the last year and a half about where U.S. policy was going. And as a clear example of that, if you try to find where the origin of the Abrahamic Accords is, at least according to former Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer, it was Bibi Netanyahu's speech to Congress in 2015. And after that speech opposing the deal, the Israelis say the Emiratis and other Gulf partners showed up and said, all right, we realize maybe the Americans aren't with us, but at least we know the Israelis see things the same way we do. Let's work together. If the Americans showed up today and say, you know what, we realized JCPOA was a bad idea, we see things the same way you do, that would have a major effect and bring people together. I think because the administration's temptation is going to be to draw out negotiations, to say we're not actually abandoning negotiations, and because the Iranian response is going to be to put pressure on the U.S. to return to negotiations, I think the role of Congress here is really important. I wouldn't want Congress to say, we managed to pressure the administration not to make the IRGC delisting concession, so we're done, or we think JCPOA is not happening, so we're done. I think there's a lot more that Congress can do here to put pressure on the administration. I think those two very immediate things are important. And then just as a third longer term point, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of American civil society, sitting next to a Jewish Iranian American, like the ability of someone like Ellie to bring, not just the U.S. message to Iran, but bring together various communities is important. And I say that as a Polish American whose father was a member of the Polish opposition movement for 15 years. He smuggled Bibles that were given by Protestant churches into the Soviet Union. He was trained by the AFL-CIO. Right? Where is that sort of engagement by U.S. Civil society in the fight for democracy in Iran? I think that is what we need in order to be successful in the long term.
Completely agree with both the last speakers. Spent 2 years at the State Department trying to build coalitions to combat Iran. Easier said than done. I will say there's a silver lining we have right now, which is if the deal does die, the Biden administration will have spent 15 months, 16 months doing exactly what the Europeans asked us to, which is, and it failed, and now it's, okay, now we try the other approach, and you guys should come with us because we tried that, it failed. The EU's same designations on the IRGC expire next year, if I'm not mistaken. Their arms embargo on Iran expires next year. There's a lot of action the European Union needs to take. They have awful leadership in Enrique Mora, just terrible leadership. But we need to work with Europe. It's very painful work, but you have to get them to work with us because the alternative of them stymieing our approach at every turn is not helpful, and it's very difficult to build a coalition. But again, look at other countries. India, big power player. UAE, Singapore, Saudi Arabia. All these countries are important. You have to do the work. We had, and we had to be clear, and I'll be clear, this wasn't targeted specifically at Iran. We had the Warsaw Process and the Warsaw Conference in the Trump administration that was building coalitions of, we had over 80 countries involved in the process of targeted and close coordination on a bunch of the issues, which Iran happened to be a threat to: missile proliferation, maritime security, energy security, human rights. There were a number of other issues where we slowly moved the ball forward and had really strong coordination with. The Biden administration ended it, which, that's fine. I will say, to their credit again, and this is one thing I think that, a Republican administration for years should actually build off of, the Summit for Democracies, I actually think is a really good idea. And, I think it didn't have quite enough teeth, but I think it's something that we can, use and adapt and improve on and build a coalition of democracies and like-minded countries and get them on the same page and understanding here are the threats that we need to work together. I wish the Biden administration had continued the Warsaw process. It was a really good process and it wasn't partisan. And, I think our next administration should, again, take the Summit for Democracies in good faith and try to work with it. We don't have to reset the wheel every 4 years. It's really counterproductive. I talk to a lot of foreign diplomats who keep saying, okay, I go to the State Department and they said the exact opposite of what you told us a year ago. It's hard for us to go back to Capitol and send that message. I keep trying to say Iran should be a bipartisan issue. It shouldn't flip every 4 years. I think a lot of Democrats are coming to understand that the current approach is failing and want to do a middle path. So I think you have to do the work. You have to do it steadily. And I think the Russian invasion is a really good catalyst for showing a lot of nations, especially European ones, hey, there is an axis of evil out here, and they're working together. Iran is sending weapons to Russia through Iraq. There's a Guardian report on it. And they should use that as a wake-up call. And I think we should, anytime we are talking to folks in Europe, in other parts of the world that are interested, we should remind them of just who Iran supports. And it's not democracy.
Behnam will give you the last word.
Oh God, they're going to go home disappointed. Listen, I strongly second everything everyone said. I don't want to be a tautologist and go through it again, so maybe just a few finer points. Again, big picture before we go broad. Big picture, the administration still wants this deal. That is one of the most unfortunate things that we have to grapple with. We've gotten to the point now where Khamenei in Iran literally copy-pastes from the State Department's spokesperson. He doesn't have to alter a word when the State Department spokesperson says sanctions don't work. And I don't think the State Department spokesperson is thinking as creatively 4, 5, 6 years out as Gabe is about the efficacy of the US dollar and going after foreign financial institutions. He's just saying right now, he's talking about the efficacy and results and macroeconomic impact of max pressure. So, the most important thing, step one, do no harm. Stop doing harm to your own position. No more self-inflicted wounds, no more own goals. Understand that it's not just what you say, it's not just what you do, it's all of it that will ultimately matter. If the leader of the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism can copy and paste talking points from the State Department, you've kind of already set yourself up for failure. To connect that to what Ellie said about why the region matters, listen, the administration's dogged approach to the JCPOA is proof that it believes the region doesn't matter, because amid all of Iran's nuclear advances, even with the Europeans, before the US began indirect negotiations with the Raisi government in November, the Europeans were saying Iran's nuclear advances erode the counterproliferation benefits of the JCPOA. Even the Europeans were saying this thing that we signed up for is not giving us what we wanted. This is the European position before America is about to indirectly engage with the Raisi government. This is what the Europeans are saying. So credit where credit is due, a little bit for them. But ultimately here, it's all about no own goals. I think until the administration is going to be obsessed with this nuclear-only approach, we have to build coalitions on the non-nuclear front, and we have the authorities to do it. Many countries have actually copied our anti-corruption sanctions. Australia, Canada, the UK, the EU all have Magnitsky-esque sanctions, but they have not sanctioned anyone in Iran under these Magnitsky authorities. Perhaps it's time to put a light to do the values and virtues-based approach towards a different foreign policy towards Iran, regardless of the nuclear debate. I'm not saying we sit out that debate. I'm just saying to understand that the administration is pursuing the JCPOA because it's trying to facilitate an exit from the region. The allies understand that. Part of the debate in Congress is beginning to understand that as well. I think we should understand that about how we talk about Iran in at least the next 2 years. That they see this not just as a JCPOA nuclear cap, but also as a way to get out of the region. And we need to tailor the way we talk and think about Iran accordingly. And that means to have them put their money where their mouth is on, okay, nuclear, not nuclear out, what about missile? What about the integrated air and defense system that Blaise was talking about? What about countering drones? What about these coalitions that have already been created? Trump administration had Operation Sentinel, the maritime security construct to stop weapons transfers. Biden administration under CENTCOM beat that up twice. There's a task force in the Persian Gulf designed to stop underwater and air drones. What's going on with that? There's a different task force that was just recently created for the Red Sea to stop the weapon shipments to Yemen. What's going on with that? It's all about enforcement. Whether it's the sanctions, one of the issues that will get us, unfortunately, to the position that Gabe talked about is Biden administration's attempt to keep the sanctions on the books but not actively enforce them. You have to enforce the penalties that you have that are legal because they will atrophy. Because there will be a time where not even your friends who do business with you will want to adhere to those penalties. So, biggest takeaway, no self-inflicted goals, no self-inflicted wounds.
I think that this was a very good end to the panel. I think we're a bit over time, so I apologize to our guests who didn't get to ask questions, and even our virtual audience, obviously. But next time, we promise to have audience questions. But in the takeaways here, there's a lot of work to do. The United States has some work to do preparing for if this regime were to collapse. Apart from the question whether that's a good thing, I think that we probably know what we think here at NUFDI. But we have some preparing to do, and there's a lot of work to rebuild our alliances and our partnerships. I think Blaise and Ellie, you both mentioned the Abrahamic Accords. If our friend Len Khodorkovsky was here, he would want us to talk a bit about the Cyrus Accords, and I think that the immense potential that the Middle East has for a free and secular democratic Iran being added to this process with our friends in Saudi Arabia and Israel and UAE and Bahrain and across the region. I think there's a lot of potential. It's a matter of are we prepared and plan well enough to get there. So hopefully we have some work to do on that. And again, thank you to the four of you, Ellie, Blaise, Gabriel, and Behnam for joining us. Thank you folks for joining us today, our previous speakers. Thanks for those of you who watch this event live. And we hope to see you at the next NUFDI event. Thank you again very much.